Hello everyone. And welcome to another part of What If Deku Was a Ghoul. If you enjoy, please like and subscribe. It really helps me. I did not write the story. The original is just low. Please support them. Now let's dive in. A quiet police precinct is a bad omen. The lack of commotion is reminiscent of the calm before a monstrous storm. It feels like the start of a new saga. Naomasa closes the door to his office, hoping that it'll be enough for him to bunker down when the predicted chaos hits. The detective's tan overcoat and hat hang from a wooden stand, matching the man's demeanor once he plops into his seat. Even though Tamakawa ordered him a new chair to replace the damaged one, he can't get quite as comfortable as he'd like. A gooseneck lamp gives him a dim light to read over reports that still need filing. But he first has to resolve the case that came before those. He uses the landline phone provided by the precinct, dialing Eraserhead's number. After a few rings, the underground hero picks up. Naomasa forces back a sigh of relief, expecting to have gotten Aizawa's answering machine instead. "I don't have time for courtesy calls," Aizawa's voice grumbles from the other end of the line. He sounds tired, per usual. Like he had just been woken up by the phone ringing. Knowing the underground hero, that's likely the case. Naomasa closes his eyes, already frustrated with the man before they can even begin their conversation. Aizawa has a knack for giving him a headache. That's not exactly what I'd like to call these checkups. But they're mandatory. The detective chooses his words carefully as he broaches the reason for reaching out. "You're calling about the kid," Aizawa says matter-of-factly. There's an audible sigh through the phone before the underground hero grunts out, "I haven't heard from him." Naomasa sits up in his seat, rectangular eyes opening wide. "You haven't?" His grip tightens on the phone. "Don't you find that the least bit concerning?" Memories of the tokyoghoul case when it first started slowly creep their way into his thoughts. The excessive amount of violence. The devouring. When Naomasa doesn't even hear the underground hero's breathing anymore, he presses the phone closer to his ear and asks again, "Aizawa?" Aizawa takes longer than Naomasa would have liked to answer. "This unorthodox approach was my idea. I'll take responsibility if he steps out of line," and his tone sounds much too reserved for such a serious matter. Naomasa shakes his head, glad that the underground hero can't see it. It's evident that Aizawa developed some sort of emotional attachment to the boy. It's going to be difficult discussing the topic. The detective struggles to help the underground hero think logically as he too attempts to think straight. "He's not one of your students. He's a..." "Don't finish that sentence." Aizawa's harsh tone cuts the detective short. The line goes silent after that. Naomasa himself isn't sure what he was going to say about Akatani Mikumo, but he knows that it would have been regretted had he said it. Though grateful Eraserhead kept him from classifying a young boy as something more extreme, Naomasa still stays staid. He swallows before saying, "Just don't forget the things that he's done." Though unable to see Aizawa's expression, the detective is sure that the underground hero will keep that in mind. Even so, Eraserhead doesn't assure him verbally, worry about catching real killers. Like Stain. The mention of another unresolved case gets the detective riled up. Stain is. But Aizawa is ruthless, in Hosu. You know where he's located and you aren't acting. A good number of heroes are assembling there to make up for our numbers, including Endeavor. Naomasa grits his teeth and caresses his forehead in an attempt to relieve some tension. "You've never pushed this hard about Stain before. Did something happen?" Ingenium, the underground hero's one-word response catches the detective by surprise. Stain's latest victim, Naomasa recalls the incident report and even has half a mind to dig it up. He instead settles on asking more directly, "A tragedy, but what about him?" He shouldn't have expected the relation to be to the underground hero himself. Of course Aizawa's answer would pertain to his kids. "He's the older brother of one of my students." "Oh," Naomasa sinks back into his chair with a hefty sigh. "I think he's going to do something stupid." He accepted an internship in Hosu. Aizawa's tone suddenly has a hint of urgency that sets the detective's nerves on fire. Understanding what kind of intentions those actions imply, Naomasa is back to sitting up straight in no time. "And you're going to let him take it?" It'd do more harm than good to put that kind of pressure on him. He'd likely just go after Stain anyways. "At least this way I can keep tabs on him." Naomasa had almost forgotten how logical the underground hero can be sometimes. With how dramatic Aizawa had been between his emotions high and his conspiracy theories, he'd have never guessed there could be any validation behind his decisions. The detective slaps a hand against his face as he tries to resist moaning in pain. "So we've got two problematic kids and the hero killer. Whether the pain is mentally or physically, he couldn't say. Aizawa sounds as equally strained but almost assuring to some extent, let me deal with the problem child and Ida. You just make sure neither has the chance to run into Stain. Unfortunately, it's much too late to prevent such an encounter, and any assurement otherwise would be misplaced. Akatani's absence from Aizawa has sent him spiraling. Straight into the night, the ghoul's limbs spin with his twisting body. The appendages latch onto sides of buildings and pull him from ledge to ledge. The ghoul is present among gargoyles, stalking the night itself. And right there with him is another predator. The kind that hunts heroes. A self-proclaimed vigilante that utilizes a katana leaps rooftop to rooftop. He's just as starved for action as the ghoul is. He thirsts for the taste of blood on the tip of his tongue all the same. So when the two clash over the same prey that they had been stalking, it's to be expected. A low-level hero who had used his status to coerce a young woman into an alley where he could have his way with her. Both hunters deemed him worthy of their aggressive nature. He's now caught in the middle of their quarrel. The low-level hero cowers in the corner of a new alley, arms barely shielding his sight of the violent battle. Stain parries 2 strikes from the ghoul's limbs like venomous vipers he must fend off before moving with unnatural speed to avoid being impaled by a third. When he brings his blade down to go on the attack, it shatters under the pressure of a 4th limb. Stain stumbles before unsheathing a pair of daggers, ducking low under a high swipe of the ghoul's tentacles. He closes the distance between himself and his fellow predator, almost losing an eye but instead being cost an ear. His opponent is fast too, avoiding an upward slash. But not dodging the second blade that nicks his shoulder. The ghoul reels back with a reflexive flick of its tails, one slamming into the hero killer's chest. Stain is sent into a brick wall, rattling whatever parts of his ribcage that aren't broken. He hits the floor just as hard, but doesn't allow himself to lose consciousness. Whoever moves quicker than the other is who will win the match. What determines the turnout is whether Stain will be able to use his quirk before the ghoul can reach him or not. The hero killer runs his tongue along the bloodied end of the dagger in his hand as the ghoul pounces. Without an inch of coiling around the hero killer, the ghoul stops. The blood-curdling effect of Stain's quirk grabs hold of the frenzied creature, holding it in a place of suspended animation. The hold that the hero killer has over the ghoul is a form of paralyzation. Such incapacitation became the hero hunter's natural instinct in his way of fighting. The same way a Komodo dragon bites its prey and then waits. The patient are deadly. Stain snarls at the grotesque features of the ghoul's leather mask, deeming it unsightly as much as its quirk. You dare to intervene, he searches for a reason or a shred of conviction within the chasm that is the ghoul's eye. Finding nothing in the void, the hero killer rips the ghoul's mask off to see what kind of face hides beneath. Only to be shocked by what lies underneath. A face much too young to witness or partake in bloodshed stares back. You're just a boy, the hero killer falters momentarily. But quickly recovers, shaking off the initial surprise. Explain yourself, his growl doesn't expose any sort of inner turmoil. Nor does the blade that presses against Akatani's neck to usher a response. Whether it's due to the difficulty talking thanks to Stain's quirk or an act of rebellion, Akatani doesn't reply. The ghoul instead bares its fangs, the boy gritting his teeth together as he struggles to break free of the hero killer's quirk. For what reason? Foolish youth? Thrill-seeking, Stain doubts the interference of his hunt was anything noble. One look at the boy exposes his animalistic nature, an override of any proper sense or judgment. Through clenched teeth, the boy seethes. Can't help it, his lips don't move but his words formulate just enough for Stain's hearing to catch, move on my own. The hero killer's eyes go from laser-focused narrowed slits to broad and baffled. He rarely misjudges people and their intentions, but the boy's reason touches him in a way he didn't expect. The few true pure-hearted heroes tell stories of how their bodies moved on their own to save lives. Stain begins wondering if the boy truly falls under that same category, fighting ferociously to save even a fake hero's life. Stain reconsiders that perhaps the boy is worth sparing. Little does he know that he completely misunderstood Akatani's angered answer. The boy's body hadn't moved to save the hero. It had moved to kill. To eat. The ghoul's starvation had reached a point so extreme that he could no longer hold himself back. When Stain leaves Akatani frozen in place, the boy considers himself anything but heroic. As a matter of fact, he starts worrying that he may be more villainous than the hero killer. The walls shake just as violently as the boy's bellicose body. With each feral swipe at nothing, there's an even more barbaric yell. Each cry is desperate, mercilessly clawing at his throat to climb out and escape. The pastry he had taken from Antiku in a futile attempt to pacify his intense hunger rises to the surface of his widespread mouth too. He staggers, nauseous. He knew this would happen, and yet, he's still surprised by the violent backlash. Akatani clutches his stomach, the pit already emptied and his craving returned. His hands tremble as they climb up from his gut to his ribcage, clinging onto his upper sides. His fingers run along the thin slots that are between bones, those slits feeling more defined than ever. His brain feels like it's swelling beyond the capacity of his skull, to the point that his starvation is too obvious to ignore any longer. He's winded, ragged breaths coming faster than the cold sweat beating down his paling skin. Again, Akatani cries out in agony. His stomach lurches and gurgles. He raises his heavy eyelids halfway only for them to fall shut. The aching in his side surges upward to meet the pain in his skull. There's something about hunger that robs the spirit as well as the body, until the ability to fight is completely stolen from him. The boy bends forward, puking out a mixture of the aforementioned half-digested pastry and bile. Saliva streams out as well, dripping from his quivering lips. His thinning body tremors too, shrinking in on itself. He locked himself in after the incident with Stain. Unable to resist his extreme urge to not only eat, but to hunt and kill, he had considered himself lucky to be stopped by the hero killer's quirk. That is until after the hunted hero fled the scene, slipping away during Akatani's brief conversation with Stain, prompting Stain to leave Akatani behind too. All alone in the alley and unable to move, all Akatani could think about was how starved he is. His hunger increased with every passing second that he returned to his home in order to be reclusive, where he wouldn't accidentally harm anyone that didn't deserve it. The hot dog vendor on Sakura Drive would have been an innocent victim. Devouring the group of teens spending their night ding-dong ditching the neighborhood would have made him a villain, not a vigilante. The ghoul claws at himself, wanting to be let out. Akatani's ribs are truly a cage, and the bones are the less than sturdy bars. He twitches and wraps his arms around himself even tighter. Pastries won't satisfy him. Not even if Aizawa were here to erase his quirk. He's waited too long. It's past the point of no return. As though the mere thought of the underground hero is enough to summon him, Akatani's cell phone rings. The caller ID shows that it's Aizawa who is trying to reach him. The boy is unable to answer, the drool pooling out of his mouth making it impossible to form a sentence. So he lets it ring. And ring. The insistent sound agitates him. It's like a bell calling him for dinner, but there's no meal on the table. Eventually, it ends. And the call goes to voicemail. Aizawa's voice filters through the phone as he leaves a message, Mikumo. You haven't been returning my calls. It's been a while since you last ate and I've recovered well enough that you should. Aside from that. A familiar younger voice interrupts, raising in volume with an added rustling, indicating that it's getting closer. Akata and I. Akata and I. Eri chirps like a bird singing a song. Eri really wants to see you, Aizawa continues as though the little girl hadn't just grabbed the phone from him. Akatani can hear the smile on the man's face though. There's a pause after that before Aizawa adds, I would like to see you again too. To make sure you're doing well. Akatani lets out a deep guttural growl as loud as his stomach's growling. The thought of Aizawa in front of him, a thin human, but a sack of meat nonetheless, the thought of flesh is enticing. Call me back soon, the underground hero ends the message he's leaving. Akatani fixates on the man's voice. He imagines Aizawa's throat. He imagines sinking his teeth into it. Eri would be with the underground hero too. She would run straight into Akatani's arms for a hug. It would be so easy to crush her. Like a boa constrictor or a python, he wouldn't even need to use his kagun. She's small, but she'd make for a delicious appetizer. The ghoul salivates as he fantasizes digging into her muscle tissue. Then, he stops. Akatani freezes in place when he realizes what he just pictured. The horror dawns on him. He had just imagined feasting on Eri. He had wanted to not only harm her, but to eat her. He screams more violently than he ever has in his entire life. He hadn't roared at the top of his lungs like this ever since the night he devoured his own mother. Tears stream down his face as he pivots in hysterics. The room spins like his head as he stumbles around. Disgusted with himself, he throws his own body against the nearest wall. The impact leaves an indentation, destroying the sheetrock. He doesn't care. Akatani's kagun sprouts from his back, tentacles whipping without rhyme or reason. The appendages are as frantic as he is. Fallen into a self-focused frenzy, he crashes into his table and shatters it. The tail swings so strongly that his body twists with them and he's sent spiraling into the kitchen. Akatani slams into a counter, shattering the ceramic. He wants to destroy himself, but all that he's capable of damaging is his home. Everything easily breaks under the sheer force of his kagun, but his body doesn't even bruise when he rams it into a piece of furniture. So he keeps screaming. At the top of his lungs, he yells out all of his pent-up frustration. The thought doesn't cross his mind that his neighbors may call the police or a hero may come out of concern of the cry for help. He's too engrossed in his own self-loathing to do much thinking anymore. His mind races, overwhelmed by a series of screeching. He can't release the same type of terrible noise, but he comes close. The hunger is one thing, but the desire to harm the ones he loves is too much for him to bear. He'd already killed his past life as Izuku Midoriya. He doesn't want to lose another. Akatani sinks slowly, falling to his knees. His shoulders shake and his body crumbles as it's racked with extreme surges of sobs. Then, something soft grabs onto those same shoulders. The feeling is light. It doesn't add to the heavy weight leaning on them. Whatever it is, it's calming. A tender touch. Akatani looks up, trying to see through the tears obscuring his vision. What he sees is a blur. But he recognizes the shape. The blonde buns. The feminine form. Akatani's blackened eyes widen, the corners cracking so much that the exposed red veins start to seep blood. At the epicenter of the dark void, each red iris shrinks as they focus on the subject in front of them. Himiko Toga. Her pale flesh ripe for the taking. All he has to do is reach out and take it. His fangs are sharper than hers. He can kill. He can eat. He can kill. He can fight it. He can resist the urge. Barely. Akatani's eyelids slam shut, closing as tight as possible. He seals off the sight of a perfect meal's beauty. It's a desperate attempt to make the blonde not appear as appetizing. But he can still smell her. Her scent is enticing. His nostrils flare as he inhales. Akatani shakes his head as hard as he can, hoping it flies off. It's just as difficult to formulate a coherent sentence as it is to hold back his instinct, but he has to warn her. Shouldn't be here. He grinds his gritted teeth as drool pools out from the corners of his mouth. He barely hears Himiko trying to respond. She's probably been saying stuff to him all this time, but his other senses had overwhelmed him to the point of tuning her out until now. He tries to focus on the sound of her voice. Not the organs that make it possible for her to speak, not her slender throat. Just her words. He hears her words. It's okay, he stops listening. It's not okay. She doesn't know. He can't expect her to understand. He shouldn't blame her. But she doesn't comprehend the danger she's in. Akatani pushes her away. Or, that's what he wants to do. He just wants to distance himself from her so that she's safe from harm. He means to do so gently. Instead, he shoves her. He lashes out with a shout and tosses her across the room. Hearing her cry out in surprise, opening his eyes to see what he's done. His hands tremble in front of him. The same hands that threw her. He tucks them into his armpits, bending over so that he can't see her pained expression. He's afraid. Afraid that he'll hurt her. He already has. Akatani whines as he tries not to hurt her again. He turns his head away, trying to focus on something else. If he doesn't see her, he might not want to hunt her. That's what he hopes for anyways. His eyes land on the door. Its hinges are broken and it's wide open. Himiko must have kicked it in. She must have come by to check on him, heard his screaming, and broke in to make sure he's safe. Akatani lowers his head, staring at the ground. He'd made the mistake of thinking about the blonde again. Akatani, Himiko tries getting his attention. The boy covers his ears, attempting to block her out. Akatani, Himiko tries again, shouting this time. She grabs his wrists and pries his hands away from his ears so that he can hear her. Akatani, look at me, she pleads. Akatani doesn't want to. He knows what'll happen if he does. He won't be able to contain himself. He'll attack her. Just knows he will. But that part of him wants to. It wants to attack. It wants to rip and tear past her skin. It wants to chow down on her intestines. The ghoul wants to look at its next meal. Akatani raises his head, no longer in control of his own body. He's shocked by what he sees. She's presenting herself to him. She's actually offering her neck to him. The left side of her cardigan is slightly pulled down, exposing her shoulder where a black bra strap is. She's blushing, but not like she usually does. This time, she's bashful. She's shy. It makes Akatani blush too. For more reasons than one, he's drawn to her. Bite me. Her voice is as tiny as her size, but it's also genuinely inviting. Akatani gawps at her, not believing what he's hearing or seeing. When her yellow eyes meet his dark voids, however, he feels a familiar sense of kinship that has him believing. He leans forward, part of him still hesitant and trying to resist out of fear that he'll go too far. But another part of him is unable to help himself. He wants to tackle her and go straight for the jugular. But he can't bring himself to do that to her. He has to hold himself back. He has to. Himiko is tired of waiting. She lurches at him first, striking suddenly. Her fangs sink into the spot between his own neck and shoulder, breaking skin and biting flesh. Akatani gasps in shock, and partly pleasure. It doesn't hurt as much as he would have expected, but it does catch him by surprise. It also does something to him instinctively. He's not just driven by an animalistic urge to feast or fight, but to bite back and assert his dominance. Akatani bites Himiko. Hard. She lets out a muffled moan, not releasing her own bite's grip. They both relish in the intimacy of the moment, sucking on each other's blood. The flavors that flow into their mouths. Akatani's RC cells and Himiko's sweet nectar. The ghoul had never tasted such blood before. It's like honey. Himiko is in a similar state of bliss. Akatani's blood is much better than any of the other people's blood that she drank. The two wrap their arms around one another, pulling their bodies closer. Neither wants to let the other loose, locking their jaws tight. Himiko's nails scrape Akatani like claws dragging across his skin. He too runs his fingers along the small of her back, like talons digging into flesh. Their moans increase in volume as they each share each other's blood. Bodies intertwined, Akatani's cocoon wraps around them both like a protective shell. Instead of tightening its hold, however, gently embraces the two. For once, Akatani doesn't feel so bad allowing lust to overcome him. There's a ringing in his ears without the use of an alarm clock. That same piercing rumbling shakes up his stomach next. And so he wakes up as if there is an emergency, as if sleeping had suddenly become a dangerous thing. Considering his nocturnal nature and the lack of bed rest prior to now, he feels that may very well be true. His heart matches the throbbing rhythm with rapid thumps as the buzzing segues from his ears to his brain. Akatani feels as though he's hungover, an after effect of some sort of drunken state that leaves him woozy. When he shifts in the bed to sit up, his shoulder screams at him too. Wincing at the sharp sting, Akatani glances at the sore spot to see a bite mark. Suddenly, he's no longer delirious. The ambience fades and his vision focuses as he sobers up. He's awake and he's able to see that he didn't sleep alone. In the bed next to him is a familiar blonde, her usual buns undone and her hair a mess. The blood in his system goes to his face, making it a bright red hue. Her body is covered by the blankets and sheets, but his imagination gets the better of him. Turning away and smacking his cheeks to calm down, Akatani shakes his head to clear away those impure thoughts. He doesn't recall doing anything of sexual nature with her. Well, not in the ordinary sense at least. His eyes are drawn back to the bite mark on his shoulder. It still hasn't healed for some reason. Even if Himiko had bitten deep enough for it to scar, that shouldn't be. His quirk has been on the fritz for a while now. It may be from the lack of nourishment, he figures. However, even if that's the case, it's a tad bit concerning. The rustling of sheets behind him has Akatani snapping out of his thoughts and turning back around. Himiko stirs from her sleep, blinking back any remaining sleepiness. No breakfast? She asks in a drowsy voice. As flustered as he should be, Akatani keeps his mind honed on the most important factor of the blonde's presence. That was dangerous, what you did. He has to remind himself of the night before and the state he was in when she had found him. He was at his tipping point, and being as close as she was to him in such a starved state of mind, things could have gone horribly wrong as opposed to how things actually turned out. Himiko, however, doesn't quite comprehend the meaning of what he's saying. Misinterpreting his statement, she blushes a bit while averting her gaze. We didn't do anything that needed a condom dash. That's not what I meant. Akatani's eyes go wide as he flails his hands in a wild gesture to make her stop. While he may have been able to keep his embarrassment at bay before, that was enough to send him over the edge. His face heats up more than the girl's. But you should still take responsibility dash, Himiko carries on anyways. Whether she didn't hear the boy or just enjoys teasing him is unclear. Himiko, but Akatani eventually has enough. The blonde stops, hearing the severity in the tone of his shout. His blush fading, Akatani schools his expression and returns his gaze to hers. I could have gone too far. What if I didn't stop at drinking your blood? What if I... His voice trails off, getting caught somewhere in his throat. Now comprehending what he meant, Himiko takes Akatani's hands in hers in an attempt to console him. Hey. I'm still here. See, she gives them a soft squeeze to show him that she's alive and well. Sighing, he nods. Thank you. For being here, he can't leave it at that though, but I still think it was too dangerous. He looks deep into her eyes. He has to let her know that she can't do anything like she did last night ever again when he gets like that. Himiko hums, staring back at him. After a moment, she breaks the contact to glance at her shoulder. There's a specifically shaped mark there that matches the one on Akatani's shoulder. Well, you did bite pretty deep. You leave one heck of a hickey, Akatani. She returns to teasing him in an attempt to lighten the mood. It works. Sort of. Akatani pulls away, embarrassed and flustered. I gotta call somebody back. He uses his phone as an excuse while unplugging it from its charging cord. Seeing Himiko brows raised inquisitively, he elaborates, it was about Eri. The blonde instantly beams at that. Oh. Let me talk to her too. Let me say hi. She's throwing the sheets that cover her off, revealing a white t-shirt with kanji that reads, pajamas. Recognizing the shirt as one of his own, Akatani swivels his body to face the opposite direction. He hastily stammers, sure, before calling Aizawa back. After a few rings, the underground hero picks up. Surprisingly, his voice isn't that groggy, problem child. You're lucky I'm up this early. Glancing around for a clock, Akatani winces slightly. Sorry. I just thought I'd return your call. I didn't really bother checking the time. He bashfully rubs the nape of his neck despite Aizawa not being able to see him. It's fine. There's nothing to apologize for. Aizawa is quick to allay the boy's worries though. Well, only momentarily. He's also quick to add, other than not calling before now. Where have you been? Yeah, I've been. Akatani struggles for an answer as he tries to come up with a valid excuse or reason to his lack of contact. It's not like he can admit to having a breakdown to a licensed hero who reports to a detective that wants to lock him away. With the lack of an answer, Aizawa makes a guess. I've made a full recovery now if that's the reason why you've been avoiding me. I haven't been avoiding you. Akatani panics at the suggestion. Even if it is a little true. Whatever you say, Aizawa huffs. Hearing how much anxiety is in the boy's tone, the underground hero lets it go for the time being. My point is, you should be able to eat now without putting a strain on me. He instead gets back to the original purpose of their meetings. Akatani hesitates, searching for a response. Thank you. But, he's not so sure he's able to face the man after what he's done or if the eating regime that they developed will even work anymore. You can't tell me you aren't hungry still. Aizawa catches the hesitation in Akatani's tone immediately. Worried about his problem child, he asks, you haven't been doing anything to hold yourself over, have you? No, Akatani shouts a little too forcibly. He grimaces at how hasty he was with his response before toning it down, No. His eyes are drawn to Himiko who's been listening in on their conversation the whole time with mild intrigue. My, friend. The blonde frowns. My girlfriend, he tilts his head hopefully. Her frown diminishes and she nods. Hi, she cranes her neck forward to be heard through the phone. I wasn't aware that you weren't alone. Aizawa somehow manages to sound both amused and annoyed. She helps. Her quirk. It can. Akatani slaps a palm against his face when he realizes how terrible he is at communicating between his newly claimed girlfriend and technical probation officer. I don't need to hear the details. Aizawa cuts the boy short. Akatani holds back a sigh of relief, realizing the underground hero is probably just as at ease to drop the subject. He then asks, was she the one behind the blood bank idea? Remembering the time he and her broke into a blood bank, all Akatani can reply with is, oh. He doesn't want to get Himiko into trouble, but answers honestly anyways, yeah, that was her. I had a hunch, Aizawa says with a small smile on his face. Akatani can practically hear the expression on the man's face as he continues, it's better than the alternative, but don't do anything like that again. Yes, sir. Akatani allows himself to have a small smile too. So, are you absolutely certain that you don't want to come over for breakfast? The smile slips when Aizawa asks about eating again. Especially when he adds, Eri would love to see you. Akatani's grip on the phone nearly crushes it when he remembers the extent of his craving and what he had fantasized doing. There's no way in hell that he could put her in that type of danger. Could you just put Eri on the phone instead? He tries to keep his emotions in check but his voice comes out strained. Aizawa must notice by the way he pauses, but he's considerate enough to let it slide. Sure, kid. Akatani holds the phone away from his ear when he hears the sound of rustling and Aizawa calling out, Eri. It's for you. Your brother Dash. Akata and I, followed by an even sharper shout from the little girl herself. Eri. Hey, Akatani smiles again upon hearing her voice. He holds the phone closer to his ear now that she's talking. Dad said I'd see you soon Dash. The sound of Aizawa choking on his saliva makes Akatani laugh. He wonders how long it's been since Eri started calling Aizawa that. She carries on cheerfully, oblivious to the man's coughing fit in the background, but it's been too long. I know. I want to see you too. He turns when he feels a tap on his shoulder. Seeing his girlfriend standing behind him, he remembers that he isn't alone. So does Himiko. He gives her an apologetic look before holding out the phone for her. Hi, Eri. Himiko flashes her teeth as she grins and speaks into the phone. Big sis. Can she come too? Eri cheers loud enough for both of them to hear without it being on speaker. Akatani shouldn't be as taken back as he is, but it truthfully hadn't dawned on him that the two girls would be missing one another's company too. Well, he scratches the top of his head as his brain tries to process the request and the current situation. Of course I can, silly, Himiko replies just as cheerfully as Eri, as though any other option wasn't even to be considered. This only further eggs Eri on, leading her to ask, when, Akata and I, when? When her older brother doesn't respond immediately or as excitedly as the two girls, Eri's tone becomes slightly discouraged and asks again, Akata and I. Though Eri is unable to see the boy's expression, Himiko can. And what she sees is concerning to say the least. The blonde worriedly asks too, Akatani, reaching out a hand to touch him. Unexpectedly, he stands up straight, making her flinch back. He keeps his expression the same but talks in a relatively even voice. It's probably gonna be a while, Eri. Oh, Eri tries to keep the whining to a minimum but her disappointment is evident. Whatever face Akatani had been making falters. The cracks in his mask expose sorrow. A trace of remorse and a wrinkle of regret trail down each of his cheeks like tears. But I want you to remember I'll always love you. You're my little sister. Even if I'm not there, I'll be keeping you safe. His voice cracks just the same as he tries not to expose his feelings any more than he already is. Eri's excitement reignites, mistaking his words for a different meaning. You're gonna be a hero? Not wanting to break her heart with an honest answer, but not wanting to lie, he refrains from responding. Instead, he says, I've gotta go, Eri. Oh. Okay, Eri's mood plummets all over again on the wild roller coaster of emotion that she's riding. Wanting to save her from any more letdowns, Akatani decides it's best to just end their call. Goodbye, it comes out as a whisper but Eri hears it. She starts to bid farewell back, by Dash, but Akatani hangs up before she can. Watching the entire exchange and the boy's stricken expressions, Himiko reaches out with a tender hand. This time, he doesn't spook her by making any sudden movements. He stays as stiff as a stone statue. Akatani? What was that about? Her face scrunches up with concern as she tries to study him more closely. When Akatani's eyes meet hers, she thinks that she understands. I'm not going to get my hunger under control and I won't put her in that kind of danger. I'd never be able to forgive myself. He's still wary of his own quirk and doesn't want to put Eri at risk. You need to stop worrying about hurting us Dash. Himiko starts to assure him otherwise but he has none of it this time. You know what I'm capable of. He knocks her arm away and pulls back. Before he can go on a rant about his quirk and the dangers of its drawbacks, he realizes that the blonde is hanging her head. Sorry. I didn't mean. He tries apologizing but Himiko raises her head and fires back. You're forgetting that it's because of who you are and what you can do that I like you. He's shocked by her words and the passionate way that she says them, remember? You saved me. You saved Eri. Like it or not, you're basically a hero. But he's still not hearing what her or anyone else has to say. He shakes his head, thinking bitterly that they'll just never understand. A hero, huh? He scoffs but feigns a smile for Himiko anyways. Thanks for not giving up on me. The blonde frowns, gaze lowering. It falls and lands on his shoulder, where she left her mark on him. Akatani notices where she's staring and looks at hers. Each of them blush, but she doesn't pass up the moment. She bumps her shoulder against his, leaning into him. You're stuck with me now. Akatani locks up, not sure how to react. But after a moment, his body relaxes. He closes his eyes and sighs. Conflicted with wanting to be happy with her but also wanting to keep her safe, he tries moving forward with his newfound plan. Himiko. If I'm a hero, then. You remember what I wanted to meet Dabi for, right? His eyes reopen to look at her seriously. Himiko looks up, staring back questionably. That League of Villains thing? Akatani nods, stealing his resolve. I want to find them. They're a danger to Eri. And like I told her, even if I can't be there for her, I'll still continue to keep her safe. He decides right then and there what he's going to be from now on. The ghoul is a monster that had been villainized, but he can at least aim that beast towards those who deserve it. Against Aizawa's better judgment, Akatani is going to leave behind his life at Antiku and commit to being a vigilante. Seeing the determination in his eyes, Himiko can't help but gush in awe. Such a cool big brother. Her face starts to heat up and she grins before grabbing onto his arm to steer him. Guess I gotta step up and do my part as her big sister. She begins pulling him towards the door so that they can start their new life together. Come on, Akatani. Let's catch a train to Hosu and find those villains, before either of them can back out and regret the decision too early. Blue hues blend with the black of the night, each blinding array of building lights whizzes by outside the window of the train. The passenger car rocks back and forth on the tracks. With Himiko resting her head on his shoulder, it's almost soothing enough for Akatani to relax. Almost. He can't quite allow himself to enjoy the moment. Not after essentially leaving his whole life behind. Again. He can't help but wonder what Eraserhead and the pro-hero's detective friend will think. Or Yoshimura. Or the friends that he made, Todoroki and Shinso. Or Eri. Akatani's head lolls to the side, resting atop Himiko's. He at least allows himself to brood a bit. He thinks about where he's headed instead. Even though that's no better or worse of a thought. He's headed straight for the Inferno, taking the train into Hosu with Himiko to find the League of Villains. Since the hero killer's activity there increased, it seems like the most likely place to find criminals lurking about. Birds of a feather flock together and all that. As a predator, it's easier to hunt and catch prey in packs rather than individually. The odds of snagging at least one from a group is higher than chasing a single target. Akatani just didn't expect to enter a literal inferno. The blue tint outside the train car's window shifts shades of color, from yellow to orange to red. Akatani sits up straight when other people in the car start to murmur over the light show, waking Himiko. Orange and red flares warp the city lights, growing brighter. It takes the spectators too long to realize why. A ball of flame is hurtling towards them, growing closer and burning harder. Akatani wraps his arms around Himiko to shield her, twisting their bodies away from where the ball of fire collides with the train car. Screams fill the metal container as glass shatters and shards spray across the tiny space. Those same yells are drowned out by the shrill sound of wind being sucked in and out of the giant hole that's been made. Akatani looks up to see what made such damage. A humanoid with green skin as pale as a dying leaf crouches down on all fours. Akatani notes that the being's brain is exposed, for eyes protruding from the organ. All they got on are gray trousers that are ripped at the calves. Akatani reaches into the back pocket of his own pants, feeling the leather of his mask. He's not sure whether what's attacking is human or something else, but his fight or flight response is telling him to fight. Akatani. Himiko squirms from under the boy's weight, but her indignant whines are more from a place of worry for him than uncomfortability. The other passengers of the damaged train car let loose a round of reactive noises again upon witnessing Akatani's slight transformation. The long sleek appendages that sprout from the small of the boy's back whip side to side as he pulls on his mask. He leaves the zipper open, baring his teeth like fangs. The red of his kakugan glows brighter than his kagun, but he's just as bloodthirsty as ever. The humanoid shrieks at the ghoul, a visceral sound that makes everyone cover their ears but the ghoul himself. From under Akatani, Himiko tries grabbing onto an ankle to stop him from engaging it. But he's too fast. In one rapid and fluid movement, the ghoul tackles the humanoid creature through the hole that it created. They twist and flip in a fast freefall from the monorail to the grounds below, passing rooftops and plummeting straight for the earth. Registering the sudden change of events, Himiko is already standing up to hurry after them. Akatani, she calls after her boyfriend before leaping out of the cart willingly. Admittedly, she wasn't prepared to be woken from her sleep by a sudden villain attack. Now that she's gotten past her grogginess though, she's more than just grouchy. She's pissed. Nobody interrupts her beauty sleep and steals her boyfriend. The blonde unsheathes a knife that she keeps handy, landing in a roll on one of the higher rooftops. Her body aches from the rough tumble but she catches herself and gets to her feet anyways. At the speed that the train was moving and how long it took for her to follow after Akatani, there's going to be some distance to travel before catching up with him. Though she's seen firsthand that he's more than capable of taking care of himself, she rushes to help him anyways. She has to close the distance as quickly as possible, because she cares too much about him to potentially lose him. As for Akatani, despite his blood and flesh withdrawal, he does handle himself well as Himiko had assumed. He binds the humanoid that he's fighting by its wrists and ankles with his predatory organ before attacking its exposed brain. His fingers claw at its open organ, ripping an eyeball loose. Gore spews across the alley that they had fallen into, filling the crater they made with a puddle of blood. The next impact in the ground comes from the humanoid alone, slammed into the cement by Akatani. It doesn't show signs of pain, just mere agitation as it tries to resist. The ghoul decides then and there that he doesn't have to hold back then. He latches onto the creature's throat, teeth sinking into its neck. Blood fills Akatani's mouth as the humanoid emits a gnarled gurgle from its damaged vocal cords. The bitten lashes out with a desperate swipe, backhanding Akatani across the chest. The humanoid has enough enhanced strength to knock the ghoul back. Akatani coughs as the wind gets blown from him, spit and blood flying out of his open mouth. The tentacles flailing after him stop his motion midair though, sparing him a second collision. One wraps around a nearby streetlight, using it as a pulley to launch the ghoul back at its opponent. A second swipe misses Akatani as he ducks under it, and with the humanoid side exposed, he takes another chunk of its strange-colored flesh. It blubbers from its lips as it tries to yell, bringing its other arm down. Akatani catches it by the wrist, applying pressure. Whether the humanoid is just too strong or the ghoul is lacking the nourishment to match that strength, the bones don't bend or break, much to Akatani's surprise. In that moment of shock, he's delivered another blow to the abdomen. The ghoul bends backwards, shoulder scraping the ground, and then contorts to land on his side. Injured, his tentacles coil protectively around him like a shield. But in between those tails, a red iris peers out with an intent to get even. When he seethes through his teeth, it sounds like a hiss. Then, the ghoul is rushing the humanoid. A red limb snakes upwards and pierces a shoulder while another sweeps out the being's legs. Then Akatani jumps with his arms and legs spread, a battle cry descending on an exposed brain. Akatani grabs onto the humanoid, fingers digging into its skin and legs locking around its waist. His teeth gnash together as they grind its brain matter, the squishy mush slopping in big bursts. Even with its neck torn out, the humanoid screeches at the top of its lungs. It staggers as it tries to remain alive, but ultimately gets devoured by its much more dominant enemy. The ghoul feasts on the unfamiliar flesh of his victim, indifferent to the bitter flavor of its green pigmentation. The fair share of meat reminds him of what it's like to actually eat. It's more satisfying than coffee or blood quenching his thirst. It's liberating. And Akatani can't get enough. He shovels handfuls of severed tendons into his gullet, swallowing them whole without bothering to chew. Saliva drips down from his chin as he inhales the scent of exposed liver. All that's capable of drawing the ghoul away from its first true meal in a long time is the promise of more. The screeching of a winged humanoid draws Akatani's eyes to the sky where he can see it flying overhead. This one is a pale yellow, its skin just as sickly as the previous creature Akatani put down. That doesn't stop him from launching himself at it to get a bite in though. In one pressurized push from the gathering of his tentacle appendages, he shoots through the air and crashes into it. The two monsters roll through the sky before crashing through a window and into a dining room. A few occupants scream as a vicious brawl breaks out. Akatani rips a chunk of flesh from the winged humanoid using his teeth before lifting it up into the ceiling. Furiously flapping its wings in a futile effort to escape, the creature shrieks in desperation. The ghoul shows no mercy, bringing the fellow beast back down into the floor and then swinging it into a wall. The wild side-to-side ends with the two falling back out the window from which they came. Each brawler lands in the street, where more panicked bystanders flee from an intense wave of fire. Akatani reacts instinctively, not wanting to get caught up in the flames. His appendages pull him from the explosions and he lands on the other side of the road. It's from there that he can see the chaos that fills the night. More genetically engineered beings roam the city of Hosu, wreaking havoc. Heroes that Akatani recognizes from Endeavor's agency fight to hold them back as best as they can. Akatani ascends the nearest building to get a better view of the battle, unsure of how he should interfere. The fog in his mind is only now starting to clear enough for him to think. It begins to register that the creatures he and the heroes are fighting likely belong to the League of Villains he and Himiko are hunting. There's no other villain organizations at the moment, and he knows personally from his own encounter with Stain that the hero killer works alone, so there's no other option. He watches as the creatures below attack indiscriminately. Even if it weren't his personalized mission to track and kill the League of Villains, they're a danger to the people that he can't ignore. Akatani leaps from his perched position, landing on a bleached white humanoid's back. Latched onto the creature like a spider or a tick, he takes a bite out of its nape. It reacts violently, pivoting its body while roaring. Unlike the prior two that the ghoul had fought, this one has an extreme muscle density to match its newfound opponent. It grabs Akatani and tosses him off. The ghoul somersaults as he flies through the air before planting his kagun into the ground to stop himself. Ready to go on his own rampage, the ghoul uses the assault of the humanoids as an opportunity to have a feeding frenzy. Akatani momentarily turns his attention away from the white one to grab an energy booster, a small one of the creatures, tearing out its heart to chew on. Then, the ghoul returns to its original target. The two clash, the white humanoid absorbing the impact and using the force of the blow to augment its muscles. The asphalt of the road cracks and crumbles as their weight shifts against one another. Then, an extreme air force is released from all the pent-up intake. Akatani is blown back just enough for the white humanoid to follow up with a surprising quirk, a tongue-web combination that snares the ghoul. Akatani struggles against the net, growling. The creature cackles. The ghoul eyes the tongue wrapping him before realizing that it's organic matter and severs it with a bite. Blood splatters across the street as the tongue is ripped apart by the ghoul's manic snapping. The white humanoid retracts what remains, making an awful sound as it does. Akatani follows the tongue back to its owner, charging in again. A hard dropkick smashes the creature's exposed brain, pink mush spraying every which way in a mixture of blood. Its eyes ooze from the same placement, rolling out of their sockets. Grinning at his fallen prey, Akatani dives in for his reward. The brain matter squishes between his teeth and the muscle fibers ooze with blood. The satisfying meal leaves more to be desired. But the remaining humanoids are already being dealt with. The heroes have restrained the weaker ones, all that remains a duplicate of the white creature. It likely outclasses them, but not Endeavor himself. The number 2 ranked hero arrives in a glowing burst of fire, his hellflame completely cauterizing the remaining creature. It's destroyed beyond repair, flesh bubbling and blistering. Not even Akatani would want to eat the burnt to a crisp being. Endeavor stands over the defeated monster victoriously, one boot atop its corpse. He surveys the property damage and his sidekicks, eyes eventually landing on Akatani. When the two meet each other's gaze, an immediate understanding of what's about to happen reaches them. Endeavor doesn't bother evacuating the area or warning anyone, he just instantly launches an attack. Akatani's single exposed eye widens as he watches a tsunami of fire head his way. Though just a kid, and though Endeavor being quite a literal hothead, he supposes he can understand why the hero decided it was a good idea to attack him. For starters, he had been eating the corpse of one of the monsters terrorizing the city. Not to mention the leather ghoulish visage mask that he's wearing. It doesn't exactly give him a good look. But still, he can't believe the guy didn't even hesitate. Akatani springs from his spot, coiling his limbs around a street post. The metal becomes superheated from the massive wave of fire that Endeavor unleashes, making him move from it to the next just as quickly. But Endeavor doesn't let up, he hurls a line of fireballs at the scurrying boy too. The ghoul hastily scrambles alongside the wall of an apartment complex to dodge the miniature explosions and takes another leap of faith to get away. But there's no fleeing from this fight. Endeavor is on him in an instant, flashing from one spot to the next to cut off his path. Akatani curses under his breath as the hero closes the distance. Unable to evade the incoming punch and becoming increasingly desperate, the ghoul does what any cornered animal would do. He bites. He catches the hero's burning fist in his mouth, sinking his teeth into the man's knuckles. Both Endeavor and Akatani feel an intense pain from the mixed contact. Endeavor reels from the bite with a shout, shocked to find his hand mangled. Akatani goes from seething through a mouthful of fire to sputtering and gagging as his lips hiss. Having his mouth burnt has the ghoul spitting out blood before he closes the zipper that exposes it. Having his knuckles chomped on makes Endeavor see red, his fist reclenching despite the pain it radiates in a burst of flame. Luckily for Akatani, and unluckily for the number 2 hero, it's right at this very moment that Himiko Toga finds her boyfriend. She strikes at Endeavor with her knife, catching him off guard just enough to cut his chest a bit. In that single fluid arriving motion, the blonde also grabs Akatani and roughly pulls him back. The two put some distance between themselves and the hero, landing behind a crushed car. "Himiko," Akatani exclaims in as much surprise as Endeavor is to have been cut by a girl in a school uniform. Himiko whirls on Akatani, exasperated and out of breath from having to get here. "What kind of hot mess did you get yourself into?" The boy watches Endeavor charge up another attack, grabbing onto Himiko and pulling her from their cover to behind another car in order to avoid the incoming move. "I don't really have an answer for that," he replies through gritted teeth as an explosion shakes the place that they once were. Endeavor isn't holding back. He's showing no mercy. He stomps towards them with heavy footfalls, boots burning into the pavement. "You're not getting away." His tone is as serious as his hyper-focused expression. Himiko rebrandishes her knife, leaping up from behind the car in between her and the hero. "Wanna bet?" She's just as angry as the number 2 hero and charges in headfirst. Endeavor meets her halfway, flames igniting from the palms of his hands as he reaches for her. As the burning limbs close in, he growls under his breath, "Only if it's your life that's at stake." If it hadn't been evident enough before, Akatani now realizes that the so-called hero isn't looking to capture them. His girlfriend's life is at stake. And oh, he leaps over the car in his way to help, but he's too far behind. He fears he isn't going to make it in time. Fortunately enough, somebody else does. A red blur swoops in at the last second, swapping places with Himiko. Akatani recognizes the scarf before he does the jagged blade that's blocking Endeavor's attack. The hero killer, Stain, has come to their rescue. Endeavor pivots back from the sudden strike and Stain sweeps his sword out to get one final lick in that manages to nick the hero's cheek. Akatani lands beside the hero killer, catching the tail end of his sentence. "Been looking forward to hunting you most of all, Endeavor." Stain pauses when he notices the ghoul's arrival and diverts his attention just enough to acknowledge the presence. "You again?" There are many things Akatani wants to say and do in that moment, many of them conflicting with the other. However, the main thing that's on his mind is his girlfriend's safety. So what he chooses to do is bow. "Thank you for saving her." Stain grunts, sparing a quick glance at the blonde that he rescued. "Get her out of here. This fight is mine now," and then he returns his attention back to the flaming hero he's about to face in combat. "You must be the hero killer." Endeavor is just as intently focused on his opponent. The fire encompassing his body increases in output in a threatening display of power. "Your reign of murder ends here." Stain matches the energy with his own, bloodlust radiating from the end of his blade when he points it directly at Endeavor. His tone holds more animosity and hatred than Akatani could manage as he boldly replies, "Just try it, you fake." Already predicting Endeavor's next move, Akatani dives for his girlfriend to shield her from the incoming blast. "Himiko," he calls out to her as his tentacles reach to make a shield. The raging inferno consumes the area around them and they're engulfed in hell's flames. The storefront window is as faded as the quality on the television screen behind it, but the dying hues of the image are still identifiable. The subtitles that have been put on to substitute for the lack of speakers are still very much readable. The kanji text says the same thing that's being shown. "Last night was a shit show." Footage plays of the hell that was raised, a combination of Endeavor's flames and fire from destruction of property blending with the window's sun glare. The top story is a student's death at the hands of supposedly Stain. The name of the deceased is Tenya Ida, a member of the Ingenium family. Endeavor is being proclaimed a hero for catching the killer and stopping the humanoid creatures called Nomu that aided him. Apparently, Stain had been working with the ones responsible for the cataclysm, which just so happens to be the League of Villains. Akatani isn't sure what to make of the information dumped onto him after the matter. Especially since he had been a part of it himself. Another big part of the story being woven by the news and media is the return of the tokyoghoul, also cited during the incident. Akatani feels his phone vibrating in his pocket, tearing his attention away from the television momentarily. He only bothers to check it because it could be Himiko trying to call him. Who he's expecting to see attempting to contact him instead is exactly who it turns out to be though. Eraserhead and his detective friend have left Akatani nearly 100 text messages and just as many missed calls, with half of those calls resulting in voicemail messages. He can't blame them after the news report on the Hosu crisis. He had just wished to have prolonged this inevitability when running away. The TV displays him with his quirk on full display, protecting Himiko from the brawl between Stain and Endeavor. The two of them had used the fight as a diversion for their escape, but didn't get away unscathed. Plenty of flames had licked their arms and legs as they fled. They had also been caught on camera, for the whole world to see. Even with his mask, Akatani had been exposed. Aizawa and Tsukachi would no doubt identify him easily. Considering their non-stop effort to get into touch with him, they likely already have. Oi! Akatani, the familiar high-pitched voice of his girlfriend alerts Akatani to her return. Before turning to face her, he crushes his cell phone with the aid of his quirk's strength enhancement. He doesn't know if the police and heroes would be able to track him somehow had he not broken it, but he doesn't want to take the chance of there being a possibility. Plus, he doesn't need the constant reminder of his betrayal towards them. With Himiko back, he doesn't have to worry about keeping the device intact for her to call him either. Himiko isn't alone. Walking alongside her is a man covered in burns despite not having been present that night. Akatani immediately recognizes him as Dabi. He's wearing a long jacket despite the warm weather, hands shoved into its pockets. "You've gone and made yourself quite the celebrity," Dabi jokes without a hint of amusement in his tone about the current situation. He gestures with a small nod while asking, "Afraid of the paparazzi?" Akatani's face scrunches up in confusion over the question, before realizing it's rhetorical and why it's being jokingly asked. He tugs at the white medical mask that he's wearing, suddenly remade aware of it covering his mouth. While it does help to conceal his identity, that wasn't the reason he had chosen to wear it. When the bands behind his ears are pulled off, he shows Dabi the burn marks around his mouth. "Your dad's a dick, dude," Akatani says through scorched lips. Dabi's normally drooped eyelids lift fully and his body stands straight, the initial shock of Akatani's words getting the better of him. He tries shaking it off by returning to his usually bored expression, "My dad," though he's missing the slouched demeanor that comes with actual relaxation, he's not. Not wanting to bother with the act, Akatani cuts Dabi off with a deadpan look that says more than any words could. Dabi's mouth stays open, but none of the lies or excuses he was going to use come out of it. Instead, he sighs heavily and asks, "How did you know?" Akatani simply holds the deadpan look. If it weren't for the burns, he's sure that Dabi would be blushing in embarrassment. The bashful expression alone is enough for them to communicate that the familial ties were obvious. Not to mention the way he acted strangely in his brother's company. Himiko glances between the two, a delighted grin on her face. Eventually, she can't hold it in anymore and lets out a fit of giggles. Akatani almost joins her, but settles for a small smile instead. Dabi groans, not agreeing that having his identity outed is as funny as they think it is. Dabi brings a hand to his forehead, just short of a facepalm as it slides down. Not a single word. He spreads his fingers to peer out at the two teens so they can see how serious he is, to anyone. But Himiko doesn't meet his eyes, still laughing. Dabi's got daddy issues, she continues to casually tease him. Until his tone turns hard to iterate, "I'm serious." His hand drops away from his face so he can shoot her a look in order to make her stop. Akatani steps forward, even though he's sure Dabi wouldn't actually do anything to harm her, he can't help but be a bit protective. "We'll keep it to ourselves," his own tone is just as hardened and defined. But it softens when he actually takes a moment and looks between his girlfriend and Dabi. "We've all got secrets about our past that we want to hide. Himiko and I understand the need for privacy." He meets Dabi's eyes while tacking on at the end, "at least a little." Dabi holds his gaze with Akatani, but ultimately breaks it first, changing the subject. His eyes return to making contact as he asks, "You and Stain were tight?" Akatani blinks in surprise, cocking his head in equal confusion. "Huh? What makes you think that?" It's Dabi's turn to deadpan. He waves a lazy hand in the general direction of the television, "It's all over the news." Himiko playfully pouts, crossing her arms under her bust and stamping her feet. She recalls Stain saving her and asks her own question about him, "How come you never introduced me to him? I'm your girlfriend, aren't I?" It was fairly recent, Himiko," Akatani stammers as he tries to pacify her with an explanation first. Once he gets the blonde to settle down, he returns his attention to Dabi. "He respected me." That explanation is a little harder for him to manage, I think. As uncertain as he is of his own relationship to Stain, he also has to wonder why Dabi bothers to care. "Why do you ask?" Dabi looks away, trying to act casual and bored as always, but his words hold a weight to them that Akatani helps carry with every word that he listens to. "When you first came to me looking for that legion or whatever, I thought nothing of it. But they're saying Stain was a part of them. And Stain's philosophy ain't half bad. I'm thinking you and I can get along." Dabi's shoe scrapes the ground as he idly kicks the sidewalk's curb with a gentle swing. Akatani raises his head after hearing Dabi's words. Are you saying? He starts to wonder if the correlation between Stain and the League of Villains also corresponds with Dabi. I know a guy. Calls himself Jiren. He's got connections. Dabi confirms those thoughts when he re-meets Akatani's eyeline. I think he can get us in touch with that club you're looking for. Himiko bounces in place, emitting Akatani's inner joy physically for him. More meat for you and more blood for me, though her delighted cheer does earn a side-eyed glance from Dabi. It's just like you wanted, right? She grins happily for him as she eagerly awaits his affirmation. Though, it's rather hard for him to have a smile at the moment. Yeah, so he puts his mask back on to hide the scars again. It's exactly what I wanted. Despite the underground hero's deliberately light step, the first floorboard of the house buckles under his footfall. Instead of creaking, the loose wood groans in protest against the weight of his boot. The ground threatens to break like the furniture that rests atop it. Behind the slits in his yellow goggles, Eraserhead's eyes narrow into a focused squint. Broken bookshelves, their contents spilled out. A destroyed couch and equally splintered chairs. He's not sure yet whether the wake of destruction is a sign of struggle or another type of rampage, but it's concerning to him either way. Behind the inspective hero, Detective Tsukachi's rectangular eyes are set in an equal state of strabismus. He too analyzes the damage with a critical gaze, drawing his own conclusions. Eraserhead looks back at him, the two communicating with a quick glance after assessing the environment. Tsukachi nods before brandishing his badge from the pocket of his overcoat. Akatani? It's Detective Naomasa Tsukachi. I'm coming in. Eraserhead moves aside so that the detective can venture beyond him by a few steps. Each footfall carries through the floorboards just like the hero's first. Let me know you're here if you can hear me. Tsukachi cautiously turns the corner at the end of the hall to check another room before calling out again, Akatani? When the detective receives no answer, the underground hero makes an attempt. Kid, his usually gruff voice holds a gentle tone that he ordinarily wouldn't use. It's Aizawa. I'm here too. Tsukachi checks over his shoulder, assessing his partner as much as the damage to the atmosphere. When Aizawa meets the gaze, Tsukachi looks away. I don't think he's here, the detective sighs while shoving his badge back into his pocket. We should still do a sweep of the house to make sure that it's empty though. The underground hero hums in agreement, not yet having lowered his guard. The door showed signs of forced entry. His voice is lowered to be just short of a whisper in case they aren't alone. Rationalizing the situation and the possibilities, he deems it possible that somebody could have kidnapped or blackmailed Akatani. Tsukachi isn't quite as convinced, but nods along anyways. Aizawa is renowned for conspiracy theories, and despite some of those notions being proven true, that's his reason for his reluctance. Not to mention the recent news footage showing Akatani back in action as the tokyoghoul. Tsukachi has to imagine he isn't the only one with resurfacing memories of the crime scenes Akatani had left behind in the beginning. The detective searches a bathroom, finding discarded box dye. Each container is for a black coloring. Akatani had no doubt been changing his hair hue to hide his identity. Tsukachi notes the detail before checking the shower, sink, and toilet for damage. When he finds nothing broken, it's safe to presume that the demolition had been limited to other confines of the house. He has half a mind to check the pantries and the fridge, but pauses in the hallway when he finds Aizawa back by the front entrance. The underground hero is surveying the door's damage, intent on proving whatever thought he has about its hinges being forcibly removed as valid. It was kicked in. Aizawa senses Tsukachi's eyes on him and addresses the detective without bothering to return the look. The hero gestures towards a marking that indicates he's right, dead in the center. A shoe imprint the same size as the one from the blood bank. Tsukachi balks at first, but quickly recovers when he sees the same evidence that Aizawa does. He mulls over the plausibility and the assumptions that can be made from that piece of information before remembering what Aizawa had theorized about Akatani's partner that night, the girlfriend. Aizawa has his own memory recollection of recent incidents, such as his phone call with the boy and his introduction to the girl not too long ago. Yes. The girlfriend. He tries to keep any judgment out of his tone but fails. Picking up on the way Aizawa sounds, Tsukachi raises a brow. You think she's a bad influence, he wonders. The underground hero looks between the door that was busted down and the detective before answering, I don't know yet. He then pushes past Tsukachi to inspect the other damages. She couldn't have been the one to have caused all this. Tsukachi rests his thumb against his bottom lip, chewing its nail as he contemplates things too. Even if she's a petite girl, it isn't impossible for her to have a quirk that grants strength of such capacity. For a moment, the thought of his dear friend Toshinori comes to mind, and how he as a hero flexes into a muscle form, the unassuming average form he has when not saving the day, as All Might doesn't give the slightest hint of power that he's capable of. How can you be so sure? The detective asks. Aizawa pulls his goggles down so that they hang around his neck along with the capture cloth he wears like a scarf. With his eyes uncovered, he meets Tsukachi's gaze. I'm assuming she's one and the same girl that he saved from Endeavor's flames during the Hosu news report. If she were capable of such destruction here, I doubt she would have required rescue. He sounds more contemplative than certain of his words. However, before Tsukachi can point that out and poke holes in the hero's hypothesis, Aizawa continues. And if Akatani was capable of killing the entire Yakuza, then I doubt a single individual would give him any trouble. Or, without a larger amount of property damage, at least, the two find themselves glancing back at the door. There's no real way of knowing what happened, but we shouldn't be making assumptions either. Tsukachi waves for Aizawa to follow him. There's more variables to be considered here anyways. The underground hero is led into the bathroom where the detective picks up an empty hair dye container to hand over for inspection. It could simply be that Akatani decided to run away with his girlfriend. Typical teenage romance. And last night was just them being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Aizawa's expression doesn't appear as hopeful as he sounds. He doesn't believe his own words, and neither does Tsukachi when he thinks about it for more than a second. He did sound strange on the phone when he was saying goodbye to Eri. As though it would be his last. Aizawa weighs the dye box in his hand like it's heavier than it actually is as he mulls over his last conversation with Akatani. Tsukachi hesitates to say this next part, uncertain of how Aizawa will react, but works up enough courage to do so anyways. I know you promised not to pry into his past. But I think we're way past promises at this point. Aizawa hears Tsukachi, but doesn't react. He just keeps staring at the dye box in his hand. Akatani had purposely altered his appearance. The boy has a reason for lying about his name. Under ordinary circumstances, it wouldn't be Aizawa's or anyone else's place to delve into why without his consent. Aizawa had grown close to the kid and his illegitimate sister. Aizawa doesn't want to betray their trust by compromising the relationship they've established. And yet, you're right, he must also be rational about the investigation. If we're going to find him, then we need to know who it is that we're actually looking for. He discards the dye box and hardens his resolve. Tsukachi does his best to look encouraging as he agrees, and that'll tell us where to look. Then he takes out his cell phone to text Tamakawa orders. I'll see what I can uncover at the precinct using what we already know about him, but I'm thinking we shouldn't limit ourselves. Aizawa takes less than a second to decipher the unspoken request from the detective, and his answer is a solid no. Tsukachi looks up from his phone mid-typing with an appalled expression, but Aizawa stays firm, shaking his head. It's never a good idea to get him involved when it comes to children. Whoever allowed that mammal to teach at a school is just as sick and delusional as he is. He knows exactly who it is that the detective wants to bring in on the investigation, and he downright refuses to make things all the more chaotic by agreeing. Tsukachi tries not to look or sound too amused by how resolute the underground hero is being. I feel like talking like that could cost you your job. He's not taking Aizawa's words that seriously. Seeing that's the case, Aizawa turns almost somber. He rarely wears his emotions on his sleeve, but he's rather adamant when it comes to Akatani. I just don't want him getting any ideas. This one is a delicate matter. He treats the boy with fragility as much as he does the girl he's adopted. Tsukachi can't help but sympathize with the man and places a consoling hand on his shoulder to say as gently as possible, it could be more fragile than you already think it is. When Aizawa looks the detective in the eye, he sees the sincerity and understands the importance without needing the added, that's why we need to know. He tries to resist, but finally gives in. Aizawa brushes Tsukachi's hand off his shoulder, fine, and heads for the exit. I'll talk to Nizu. Tsukachi watches Aizawa's receding back, but doesn't bother chasing after it. After all, he has to treat the scene properly and get a forensics team over. The detective turns around to get one last good look at the mess that's been made. He doesn't want to regret giving the boy a chance, but he's not so sure he's dealing with a basic boy. All the blood that's been spilled and all the lies that have been told. Just who is Akatani Mikumo? Was he always just the Tokyoghoul in disguise? When the trio of league candidates first enter the bar, their initial impression of the barren brick walls is that the significantly spacious hideaway is just short of being a less than decorative basement dwelling. Muted colors of bottles on the shelves behind the bar counter match the unadorned lazy spin of the ceiling fan. The place itself seems just as disinteresting as its disinterested patrons. A man with faded blue hair sits with his back to Akatani, Dabi, and Himiko. The living purple mist behind the counter faces the group instead, the only one well-dressed for the occasion. Not even Jiren, the intermediary middleman, bothers with a classy fashion sense. He opts to wear nothing more chic than a fluffy scarf and circular glasses. I've got some kids here saying they're interested in your group. I assure you, these ones are more capable than the last bunch. Not like the other recruits. He twists a toothpick in his mouth with his tongue as he speaks, however, the slight slurring of words is still decipherable. Akatani and the others are expecting who they assume is the bartender to speak in response, but it's the blue-haired man that Jiren happened to be actually addressing. And? Who are they? He turns his head just enough for the trio to get a glimpse of his chapped lips grinding out his questions. Jiren grins, all teeth -1 in the middle on full display. He gestures towards the bunch with a mild flourish, as though he's presenting them. I'll let them speak for themselves. His eyes glint the same as his tinted glasses when he glances towards the group that he's brought. Himiko, the most enthusiastic of the trio, is the first to jump at the opportunity of an introduction. You're friends with Mr. Staney, right? We've been looking for you. She practically vibrates in place as her face tinges red in excitement. The blue-haired man does bother to spare a glance over his shoulder, but it's a rather dismissive look. He has red eyes crusted around the edges that flick over to Dabi instead. You don't look like very much of a league. You look rather gross, actually. Dabi returns the critical gaze with one of his own squinted glares. Hearing that must strike a nerve, because the man returns to his former state, no longer considering them worthy of a second glance. Kurojiiri. Warp them away. He lazily waves a hand as though he's shooing away a fly. Akatani mentally notes the bartender's name and potential teleportation quirk before listening to the rest, a brat, a guy with no manners, and a silent creep. I don't like any of them. Himiko's earlier excitement diminishes a little, an expression of disappointment overcoming her as she cocks her head to the side. Huh? The one named Kurojiiri gives the girl somewhat of an apologetic glance before denying the blue-haired man's request. Come now, they've traveled all this way just to meet you. You may as well humor them with a chat. Kurojiiri's gaze then shifts to Jiren. What's more, if they're being introduced by our influential broker friend here, we can be sure that they're at least competent fighters. Jiren shrugs, not elaborating on whether they are or aren't. Akatani doesn't know how acquainted Himiko and Dabi are with him for him to actually know, plus the broker had only met him personally very recently to definitely not know, but it's a response he can get behind during a sensitive negotiation. Either way, I'll take my finder's fee now. Jiren holds out his hand with the expectation of receiving payment. But Kurojiiri isn't quite as accommodating a second time. He raises up his own hand, introductions first, denying the request momentarily. Jiren begrudgingly retracts his hand and nods for the trio to share their names. I'm Himiko Toga, Akatani's girlfriend, does the liberty of starting them off, and this is Akatani. I go by Dabi right now. Dabi does his own introduction. Himiko and Akatani, knowing his real name, share a look with one another, but don't say anything out loud. The blue-haired man turns around, now giving them all his undivided attention. No good. I want to know your real name, but he singles out Dabi with a pointed finger specifically. Before things can escalate, Akatani decides that it's finally time that he says something. He takes a step forward to direct everyone's attention to him before announcing, I'm the tokyoghoul. Everyone aside from Himiko shares an expression that crosses both shock and awe. But Akatani isn't finished. He looks around the small bar, still only counting 2 people present. And you're the League of Villains? Is this really all of you? It's his turn to be unimpressed by what he sees. The blue-haired man seems skeptical, his critical gaze from earlier returning full swing. But he still humors Akatani. Yes. I'm the leader. Now knowing that he's finally found the last of his targets and that they're of small numbers, with the leader right in front of him, he's already calculating how to kill them. The leader taps a finger on the bar counter as he demands from Akatani, prove you are who you say you are. His scara darkening, the ghoul obliges. A predatory instinct kicks in, back burning to unleash his equivalent of claws. He remembers Aizawa's bandages. Eri's guardian and his previously poor condition within the Udata med bay. Akatani plans to return the favor. The ghoul growls as he prepares to pounce. Oh, I intend to. But as forthwith as his killing intent had expanded, it instantaneously evaporates. An equal force opposes his own, casting over him like the shadow of a bigger beast. Akatani's burning blood runs cold when he hears an amused chuckle coming from behind the bar counter. His eyes are drawn to the source of intimidation, spotting a miniature television that says "Only Audio" in kanji as red as his shrunken pupils. No need, the disembodied voice is deceptively soothing. Hidden in the tone, is that same dominant power Akatani had sensed. It's a deep and demanding boom. "I would like a private audience with our most prestigious guest, if you mind." The League of Villains leader doesn't seem so much like the actual leader anymore when he inquisitively stares at the small TV monitor. "Sensei." The owner of the voice remains in charge, making it clear that was an order and not a request. Take time to get acquainted with his friends, Tamura. You may learn a thing or two about companionship and allegiance. They sound as though they're talking down to a child. The power dynamic and who reigns in superiority is more evident than ever. It'd be funny if it weren't so terrifying. Akatani looks back at Himiko and Dabi, expecting the true leader to reveal themselves. But he's suddenly struck by a wave of nausea, throwing him off balance. He can feel something climbing up his throat. He feels sick. It's reminiscent of when he vomits the unprocessed attempts at eating anything other than flesh. Wait dash, but what comes out of his mouth this time instead is a black goo as flexible and tangible as his cocoon. It wraps around his body, covering his face and concealing his vision. And then, suddenly, the darkness transports him to a room just as pitch black. What? He fights the gag reflex of having something forcibly breach the walls of his throat but fails miserably. Momentarily, he wonders if that was Kurojire's warping quirk. However, that thought is immediately overtaken by panicked voices when the presence he had felt earlier increases tenfold. His instincts scream at him. His mind yells just as vocally. But his body becomes paralyzed. He's trapped in a state of petrification as the crushing pressure of sheer power makes itself known to him. The aura makes Akatani collapse to his knees, his whole body bending over as he fights back the urge to puke for real this time. He's being forced to bow to the mightier being. The submissive state is one that he knows well. He's seen his own prey do the same sometimes. To be on the receiving end for once, he can't help but shed tears. He can hear the beeping of a heartbeat monitor. He's not sure if that's real or if it's a part of what he's currently imagining. The extreme emanation forces him to experience hallucinations of his own death as well. Torn and dismembered like he's left some of his own victims. Shredded and violated. Drowning in his own blood. Suffocating as he's choked by the tremendous pressure. Stabbed through his pounding heart, pierced and cut wide open. He feels as though he's falling from a great height. Then he lands in hell where he burns alive. Each assaulting image is a beating that makes his entire body tremble. The voice returns, making Akatani shudder. He's pretty sure that voice belongs to the devil. This is the first time you've felt inferior to another out of a naturally born instinct. Isn't it? The tone is genuinely inquisitive rather than taunting. That only intensifies the effect of the feeling he's unable to endure. He feels like an ant that's being studied, played with, by a giant that could squash it at any moment it loses interest. All Akatani can manage is a meek nod. His mind is too distraught to think of a verbal response. Though he'd doubtfully be capable of formulating any coherent speech if he were thinking clearly. Akatani recluses at the close proximity of the voice. You have no conception of how far up the food chain goes, boy. It sounds so close and yet so distant at the same time. The most lethal of predators are good at concealing their bloodlust. You should take that advice into practice. I could easily sense your hostile intent towards Tamura. Akatani recognizes the tone as the same that had been used with the so-called Tamura. He's being talked down to, perceived as an inferior child. In the presence of this being, he knows that to be true. Have you nothing to say for yourself, boy? Akatani's throat is too dry to say anything. Until, the same force that commands him to be docile demands that he speak. He's a threat. Akatani's voice trembles more than his body as he admits to the desire of wanting Tamura dead. He knows he can be smited easily should the owner of the voice so deem it, and he's just given them a valid reason. To the child you've grown an attachment with, the true leader of the League of Villains shocks Akatani even more. He's shaken to his core that such an unstoppable force knows about his relationship to Eri as the reason for their being at odds. Don't be so surprised. I'm capable of reading your thoughts like an open book. Through all the terror and desperation, it's easy to find the root of those emotions. Akatani struggles to breathe as he takes in that information. His mind is capable of being invaded, his thoughts read, and quite possibly corrupted. He theorizes that the feeling he's perceiving from the Mindreader's presence comes from that same source of power. But part of him knows that a good margin is genuinely just the person's unmitigated existence. Unfortunately, I cannot allow you to end Tamura's life. He is of importance to me. He's reminded of that aura when it washes over him like a wave in an ever-endless bottomless sea. However, I see a potential in you that would be a shame to waste. You could prove useful to Tamura. Before he can sink to the bottom and drown, crushed by the pressure, he feels himself pulled back to the surface. Akatani gasps for air as he greedily tries to inhale it all for himself. The force that had been weighing down on him has been significantly lifted, but his body still falls to the floor. He's beyond exhausted. Who? Who are you? He tries to get a good look at who caused him such grief. In the thick darkness, he can make out what looks like the equivalent of a throne. Several wires and cables are connected to it, an array of monitors much like the one from the bar also attached. And seated at its center, is a well-dressed man. I have many names. Most prominently, All for One, in account for my abundance of quirks and the unique ability to take more from others. The promise of power from that introduction alone has Akatani quivering all over again. But when he sees the face belonging to that power, he's beyond horrified. But you will call me Sensei. The scarred flesh where eyes should be somehow stares into Akatani's soul more than actual eyes would be able to. Why, you plan to take my quirk from me? It suddenly makes sense to him how someone could be so limitlessly indomitable. Oh? What's this? A kindling of hope that I hear. All for One tilts his head to the side as he outwardly notes Akatani's tone. How interesting. Akatani imagines a life without his quirk. If it weren't for his uncontrollable impulses and his extreme urges, he would have been able to lead a regular life. His mother would still be alive. Maybe, just maybe, he would have been able to still get into you.A with Kaken. I can only view your thoughts so much. Would you be opposed to meeting a quirk specialist colleague of mine? All for One's intrigue sends shivers down Akatani's spine and he begins to regret the desire to be rid of his quirk. He can't imagine someone so evil increasing their strength with his quirk too. What do you want from me? Akatani struggles to push himself upwards. It takes all he has, but he somehow manages to push off with his hands and just stay on his knees. All for One watches the boy with sick pleasure, smiling softly as he enjoys the entertaining display. He speaks at a low decibel, almost assuredly, not your quirk. Though powerful, it wouldn't pale in comparison to my arsenal, but conveys anything but a form of assurance. I'm much more interested in your mind, especially when he extends a hand. Akatani instinctively shies away from the near contact, all sorts of alarms and warnings going off in his head. Especially when he sees something crawling beneath the surface of the man's sleeve. The length and size of All for One's fingers, a red-headed centipede twists itself around his hand and reaches towards Akatani. Acting on a survival reflex, his senses telling him it's no ordinary insect, the boy scurries back faster than the actual bug crawls. Akatani pants heavily, his unnatural pupils focused on the centipede that reaches just short of his face. Its preformal spines twiddle in an attempt at making contact. If All for One is displeased, he doesn't show it. If anything, he finds the reaction humorous, letting out a low chuckle. He pulls his arm away, the centipede retreating back under his sleeve. We'll both have to test our patience then. He lifts the same hand he had used to prop his chin against his knuckles, another time. Akatani swallows in between heavy breaths, unable to express anything but relief that he hadn't been subjected to whatever All for One literally had up his sleeve. Though he also can't help but be unsettled by the unspoken promise of another time. He shakily lifts his head, daring to look at the man responsible for such an impending feeling of absolute damnation. The business attire is almost as casual as his sitting position, the lack of a tie and the few loose buttons at the top are nonchalant. Yet, the face that wears it all is just like the aura he emits. A horrifically sinister contortion of what a person's worst self can be, personified as a form of evil. Even without sockets, Akatani can feel All for One's eyes on him. He's not sure how the man can see, but he knows that he must. He can't help but shake the feeling of being studied like he's bacteria under a microscope. You will return to Tamura and agree to work with him. You will not harm him if you don't want the same to be done to the girls you're so fond of. Akatani feels small in comparison to the potential menace of this particular predator. He has no choice but to accept the true monster's conditions, now knowing his role in the criminal climate has drastically changed. The threat to Eri and Himiko is one that can be delivered on and he'd be unable to do anything about it. He's been caged again, this time by something far worse than the heroes. He remembers what All for One wished to be addressed as and answers, "Why, yes, sensei." All for One's smile becomes even more wicked, if that's even possible. The tokyoghoul is now his pet. The cool breeze brushing through his hair is the only thing that reminds him of his physical presence. The whir from the ceiling fan is the only thing that reminds him of his ability to still hear properly. His senses are in such a state of disarray that they each lock onto the spin above him, his eyes dizzying with his mind. He hadn't experienced such a state since the time he killed and devoured his mother. He feels lost in a strange place that he doesn't belong. Back then, it had been the wilderness as a child without his mom's embrace. Now, it's an equally hostile environment without the limbs of his Kagun to shield him. Absent-mindedly, Akatani digs a fingernail into the bar counter in front of him. Like a claw, he grinds the wood so that it chips and splinters. The surface already has its fair share of scratches anyways that he doesn't particularly feel bad about adding more. The distraction is somehow comforting that he wouldn't want to stop even if he did. Each time he scrapes away a piece of the counter, he feels like he's carving out his problems. The shavings start to collect to the point of formulating a pile, so he brushes them off and they fall to the floor. Then, something gets slid towards him. He pauses his newfound wood-carving hobby to glance up at it. A small rectangular package rests on the unscathed part of the bar counter, wrapped in what appears to be butcher paper. Akatani raises his head a little more to see who placed it there. The purple wisp of smoke dressed in elegant clothing stares back at the boy. Akatani asks the smoky man, "What's this?" He remembers the villain's name is Kurogyri. Kurogyri doesn't divert his attention, stoic and stiff as ever while addressing Akatani. "You're looking rather pale. Consider it a complimentary meal," though one of his hands does gesture in reference to the miniature package. Akatani grits his teeth together, blaming his discoloration on his newly appointed sensei. Just thinking of the devil's personification makes him shudder and sweat. When his mind returns to the present and no longer lingers on that dark room which may as well had been hell, he sees Kurogyri waiting patiently. Akatani clears his throat and starts to deny the food offering. "I don't have any money dash." It's on the house, but gets interrupted as politely as possible. Even Kurogyri's tone sounds sympathetically considerate. Akatani eyes the bartender warily, not buying into the act. He's not forgetting the man is a villain that works under the employ of someone far worse. Besides, he has a valid reason for denying the food. "My diet isn't like others." He tries pushing the packaged meal away. But Kurogyri blocks his attempt by resting his own hand on the parcel too. "We at the League of Villains took that into account." He pushes back as gently as possible. Akatani allows the bartender to slide it more into his space out of curiosity. When the package is in front of him, Akatani unwraps the thin butcher paper that's been quadruply layered. He catches a whiff of a familiar scent before his eyes recognize the meat inside as human flesh. Muscle fibers and tendons have been sliced like cold cuts for his convenience. Akatani can't suppress the saliva that starts to fill up in his mouth, so he mumbles a "thanks" and digs in. Kurogyri momentarily watches the boy eat before asking, "Would you care for a cup of coffee as well?" Akatani pauses as he considers the question. He's in a bar, but he's underage. Aside from water, he supposes there isn't much else the bartender would offer. Though it does creep him out to think his new sensei could already know all there is to know about him. He eventually decides to ignore his paranoia and gives in with a nod. Kurogyri returns the gesture with a single nod of his own before brewing a cup. He fusses behind the counter a little bit before grabbing a glass container full of brown squares and asking, "Sugar?" Akatani starts to deny the offer with an explanation, "My taste palette dash. These aren't ordinary sugar cubes," but gets cut off. Akatani indicates Kurogyri to continue with a curious tilt of his head. "Infused brain matter. Designed specifically for you." The explanation has Akatani recalling the humanoid creatures called Nomu that he had fought in Hosu. The Nomu had their brains exposed, which means the validity of that statement in terms of what organs are or aren't hard to come by must be true. Akatani eyes the small brown blocks with a sneaking suspicion. His nose tells him that they aren't drugged or poisoned, so he trusts in his senses. "Sure. I'll try it." He figures there's nothing to lose if it'll help quench his appetite. Judging by the upturn of the bartender's yellow slants for eyes, Akatani assumes Kurogyri is smiling. You won't regret it. He adds the cubes to the coffee concoction before placing the cup in front of the boy. Akatani blows on the steaming drink before taking a sip. To his surprise, it tastes better than any other coffee he's had prior. It also helps to sober him to his surroundings and clear the fog in his mind. Glancing around the bar, he questions the first thing that he failed to notice until now: where's Himiko and Dabi? Kurojairi grabs a rag and busies himself with cleaning a shot glass as he answers, with Tamura. Like you, they were re-evaluated and welcomed into the fold. Remembering Tamura's hostility when first meeting his friends, that explanation doesn't do much to allay Akatani's concerns about their absence. But where, he stresses the emphasis of his inquiry to get a better answer. Taking note of Akatani's worries, Kurojairi pauses his cleaning to assure the boy, they're safe. We have no intention of harming our own allies. And then elaborates on their whereabouts per request. You have a residence here as well. They're being shown their rooms. At that, Akatani raises his eyebrows in a combination of confusion and interest. Food and bed? Is this a hotel or a bar? He tries to play it off as a joke but can't help but imagine what he and Himiko would have done otherwise. Part of him wonders if Dabi would have let them stay with him, if he even has a place of his own. The money he saved from working at Antiku wouldn't have got them further than a few weeks. Are you not grateful? Kurojairi resumes, wiping down glasses now that the mood has shifted to something more lighthearted. Though, that doesn't last very long. Akatani doesn't want to owe a debt to the League. He doesn't want to be shown hospitality by villains. He may be deterred by Sensei momentarily, but he refuses to forget his goal. Kurojairi and Tamura are still his targets. He'll kill them. Not today. Nor tomorrow. But eventually. So he answers Kurojairi with a curt, no. I'm not. Meanwhile, Akatani's yesterday catches up with him. There's no outrunning his past when a certain rat is running the maze. After class hours, Aizawa enters Nizu's office for a discussion that he'd been dreading the entire teaching day. He's filled with even more despair when he finds Detective Tsukachi also there with one of his students. Bakugo. It's after school hours. Shouldn't you be at home? Aizawa fixes his focus on the spiky-haired blonde first. Though Nizu is quick to confirm the teacher's suspicion of the boy's presence, actually Aizawa, Mr. Bakugo is here per my request, much to his dismay. Aizawa sighs before also taking a seat, getting settled in for the long haul of what he's sure ought to be a headache-inducing conversation. And why is one of my students present for this? You'll never guess the coincidence. Tsukachi glances over at the underground hero before nodding towards Nizu. The principal returns the gesture before turning the computer screen on his desk to face the other way. On the monitor is a green-haired boy with a face full of freckles. Meet Izuku Midoriya. Bakugo frowns. Tsukachi stares at Aizawa from the corner of his eye. Aizawa finds the face familiar but can't quite place it until Nizu reveals the identity for him, or as you may have come to know him, Akatani Mikumo. Aizawa's eyes broaden when he places the features. The outdated picture shows an extreme evolution occurred, but the kid is undeniably one and the same. What's Bakugo got to do with him? Aizawa redirects his attention as he tries to think of a correlation. Bakugo meets his teacher's gaze as he explains, I grew up with the nerd. I knew him before he the pause has Aizawa raise a brow. Before he ran away, Bakugo averts his eyes. The avoidance of eye contact has Aizawa asking, ran away? Bakugo nods. When he realizes his teacher is waiting on a verbal answer, he elaborates, after his mom died, he just vanished. His mother, Aizawa's breath hitches as he starts to learn about Akatani, Izuku Midoriya's past. Shit got really fucked. His quirk manifested and he bit me. Then he stopped coming to school. Then his mom, the details of Bakugo's recollection start to come fast but end on a more somber note, he fucking ate Auntie Inko. It suddenly makes sense to Aizawa why the boy was so intent on covering up his past. The disdain for his own quirk and how he had to cope with its effects. He's only a child and he had reformatted his whole identity to accommodate for the danger he saw in himself. All Aizawa can manage to say instead of a swear word is, Christ. Detective Tsukachi and I had similar reactions, but I'm afraid you're a little late to receiving that information for us to dwell too long on it. Nizu unsympathetically brushes it aside in order to move on with his other findings. But Aizawa is still processing the travesty for him to be as eager, the kid ate his own mother. Let's just calm down. Please, Aizawa, have a seat. Tsukachi rests a hand on the underground hero's shoulder to keep him from standing up. Nizu also makes an attempt to de-escalate the situation. Would you like a cup of tea? Though all the principal's suggestion does is earn another glare from Aizawa. No. I would not. Suit yourself, Nizu easily shrugs it off. He continues with his casual demeanor to type into the system and pull up a new file. While Mr. Midoriya's mother is no longer with us, we shouldn't neglect the boy's father. Auntie Inko always said the deadbeat bastard worked overseas. Bakugo provides his relatively helpful input about the matter from the sidelines. And Tsukachi bounces off of it to also explain, which is why it'll be difficult to get a hold of him for questioning. Aizawa doesn't like the sounds of that, but waits to hear more before asking anything. The computer screen switches to a new photo ID, this one a splitting image of Izuku if he were aged up by 20 to 30 years. Hisashi Midoriya. Nothing too abnormal about his record. Although, I do find the lack of concern for his wife or son rather odd. He never left America for her funeral, nor did he bother to search for young Midoriya. Nizu provides a rundown of the information he's gathered on the man. But Aizawa doesn't find any of it the least bit helpful. That doesn't mean he'd have anything to offer if we could speak with him. That just means he's an asshole. My thoughts exactly. Nizu beams with a smile like the lack of a lead is a good thing. Tsukachi draws everyone's attention to him when he voices that problem out loud. Despite learning more about the kid, we're not left with many leads. Though not without a small caveat towards Aizawa, Nizu and I were hoping you might be able to get something out of this. The underground hero recoils at the implication. He figured the rat would have some delusional gimmick in mind for solving the investigation, but he hadn't expected it from Tsukachi. He wonders just what exactly they have in mind. They thought you'd be able to get through to me, or whatever. Bakugo's grumbled answer from the corner wasn't what Aizawa had been expecting either. The blonde crosses his arms as he continues to growl, it's not about opening up. If I knew something about the nerd, I'd tell you. I seriously haven't seen him since he ran off. Suddenly, Aizawa has an epiphany. The connection with Bakugo reminds him that there are other students in his class who may also have ties with Midoriya. Todoroki had been mentioned by Eri, as well as Shinso, who he had taken under his wing ever since the sports festival. Actually, Bakugo isn't the only student under my tutelage with a connection to aka Midoriya. He starts to find the intel from the meeting all the more insightful now that he's actually got more leads. Bakugo shakes his head in dismissal of the possibility. The nerd didn't have any other friends besides me growing up. But Aizawa shakes his head too. These are more recent, having all the more reason to be hopeful of these potential leads. They might know where to find him. Tsukachi starts to catch on and agrees that they could make or break the case. Nizu folds his paws neatly, leaning back in his chair with as chipper an attitude as ever. Well, let's invite them in for some tea, shall we? His tiny grin implies that he sees more of an opportunity than they do. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like, subscribe and support the original writer. See you in the next part.